of Georgia. Implications: the Middle East, NATO, and U.S.-Russian relations, as well as other implications, perhaps. We try to continually look at Russia here at the Council. Since it is a great power, it remains a critical actor in international affairs, and we're delighted that we have with us tonight someone who has spent his career looking at the Soviet Union and Russia and the Middle East as well. Professor Freedman is the Peggy Mirestone Pearlstone Professor of Political Science Emeritus, Baltimore Hebrew University, and as you know, Bob, for a number of years was also president of that institution. He's now a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins, where he's teaching courses on Russia and the Middle East. He's written 5 books on Russian foreign policy. He's completing a 6th on Russian foreign policy since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I don't know if Mr. Putin's behavior is going to prohibit his finishing that book, but in any case, we're in the midst of an interesting period there. It might be hard to complete it at this point. But he's done that, and he's also edited 14 books that have to do with Russia and the Middle East and Israel, that composite of areas. I can remember Bob talking about the Caspian Sea and oil many years ago. He reminds me that he's been looking at these things since 1991, a long time at that particular area of the world on those particular problems, which are going to be the focal point of his presentation tonight. Professor Freedman is a consultant with the United States State Department, with the Central Intelligence Agency. He's been served as a commentator on Voice of America, on the BBC, public radio. He's not a constant commentator, but a frequent commentator on an Arab station in London as well. He's lectured to the Defense Ministry of Israel, to their foreign ministry as well. His interviews for his work have included Arafat and Abbas, Rabin, Sharon, and others. Bob's a very serious student. He, on the practical side, has been on delegations that have gone to Beijing and Moscow to discuss the Middle East. He's met with Palestinians to discuss the same questions of peace in the Middle East. After 9/11, he met with European leaders and scholars to discuss the Middle East. So he's had an extraordinarily broad, practical set of experiences that are circled about his very powerful academic credentials. We have an absolutely marvelous expert on the area tonight. It's my great pleasure to present Robert O. Freedman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burd, for your very warm introduction. As Dr. Burd mentioned, this is my 4th time having the honor of speaking to the Council. First time was way back in 1980. We talked about Jerusalem and its future. Then in 1992, after Rabin was elected, we talked about the possibility of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. In 2004, we did an initial study of the Bush administration and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, if you look at all these themes, Jerusalem remains a big problem, maybe even a bigger problem than before in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Number 2, well, we've made some progress in the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1992. Jordan and Israel now are at peace. There's still a long way to go. In terms of the Bush administration's policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict, at best it has a mixed record. So if you look at these 3, can I be optimistic about Russia and Georgia? Probably not, but we'll do our best. What I want to do tonight is talk basically about 4 things. Number 1, why Russia did what it did in Georgia. Number 2, I want to discuss the fact that this was not a one-time event in Russian foreign policy, but just the latest example of an aggressive policy of Vladimir Putin, first as Russia's president and now as its prime minister. Third thing we'll take a look at is the impact on the Middle East of the invasion of Georgia. And we'll take a look in particular at 4 different countries: Syria, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, all of which are very important in Russian strategy. Finally, we'll wind up with our look at NATO and Russian-American relations and try to answer the question that Dr. Burd was so kind as to pose for me: are we back in a new Cold War or not? Well, let me begin with the question of why Russia did what it did in Georgia. Now, I usually never read anything, as you know, in my lecture, but I just thought I would read to you what Secretary of State Rice said about this just 2 weeks ago, and I'm quoting now. Russia's actions in Georgia fit into a worsening pattern of behavior over the past few years. Number 1, intimidation of neighboring states. Number 2, use of its oil and natural gas resources as political weapons. Number 3, arms sales to states and groups that threaten international security. And she summed up her speech, and was a major policy speech, by saying, the emerging picture is that of a Russia increasingly authoritarian at home and aggressive abroad. To which Russia's new president, Mr. Medvedev, responded that, after all, we Russians need our own sphere of influence. However, the history of U.S.-Russian relations has seen quite a few acute situations, but common sense, pragmatism, and respect for each other's interests always prevailed in the end. Well, we shall see. I'm not perhaps as optimistic as Mr. Medvedev. All right, let's take a look at the Russian-Georgian situation. Now, we're still awaiting the definitive analysis of who did what to whom when. And I guess as historians and analysts, we're not going to be able to write the history of the war until we get more data than we have now. So what I'm going to share with you is my own analysis of the events and how at least they seem to me to fit into place. Well, first of all, there are 3 reasons why Mr. Putin want to have it out at Mr. Saakashvili. Number 1, Georgia was the first of the so-called colored revolutions in the former Soviet Union, where an individual came to power on the back of a massive popular protest. Needless to say, Mr. Putin and now Mr. Medvedev are very worried about the same thing happening in Russia, and they've taken measures to try to prevent it. And so this was problem number 1. Problem number 2, again, as Dr. Burd mentioned earlier, Georgia is the transit point for major oil and natural gas pipelines from Azerbaijan, from the Caspian. And I'm sure you've all heard of Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. There's also Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum natural gas pipeline. And why this is so important is that Russia is beginning to top off its production of oil and natural gas. In fact, they're beginning to decline, and if you want to go into the reasons, I'd be happy to in the Q&A afterwards. Consequently, Russia is very concerned about getting control of as much of the oil and natural gas, not only in its own area around the Caspian, but it's trying to get in Iran, Libya, and elsewhere. But it has a desire to control the Caspian oil and natural gas pipelines. And what Russia is very worried about is if a pipeline, natural gas pipeline, is built that will carry Kazakh natural gas and Turkmen natural gas across to link up with the natural gas pipeline that goes from Azerbaijan through Georgia to Turkey. This would be a major amount of natural gas not under Russian control. So I think an attempt to sabotage this whole pipeline effort was the second goal of the Russian operation. Now, number 3, the Georgians won into NATO. Now, NATO, during the early years of Yeltsin, had a plus and minus relationship with Russia. A NATO-Russia Council was established. The Russians were brought in as consultants, and it was sort of live and let live, although periodically you heard Yeltsin say, we don't like the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders, and of course the U.S. response was, well, NATO is a defensive organization. What are you worried about? In any case, Georgia was particularly loud in its desire to get into NATO, and I think this is the third reason why the Russians went in to nip that in the bud. Now, if you look at the data itself, we saw increasing pressure from Russia on Georgia during the summer before the invasion. Russia shot down Georgian drones that were overflying Abkhazia and South Ossetia, part territorially of Georgia, although inhabited by people who are not Georgians and don't want to be in Georgia. Then the Russians went ahead and started giving out citizenship papers to Abkhaz and South Ossetians. Then they started overflying Georgia itself, and Moscow radio said, to cool the heads of the Georgians. Finally, apparently the South Ossetians got the okay from Russia after Russia kept moving troops in and out of both Abkhazia and South Ossetia to start firing artillery against the Georgians. And what happened with Saakashvili, the Georgian president, felt he had to respond. So this was sort of a sucker punch from the Russians. Well, he's killing people who have Russian citizenship, says Putin, therefore we have to invade. And invade they did. But not only to protect Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but they took over large chunks of Georgia as well. Now, in theory, they're supposed to pull back just to Abkhazia and South Ossetia by the 10th of October. That's 8 days from now. As European Union peacekeepers, observers are supposedly going in there. We'll see. There'll be a real test of EU-Russian relations. But if you look at this event, it's not just an isolated event. And here we come to my second point. It's at the end of a long chain of rather aggressive Russian actions. Now, I think we have to just step back for a minute, if we could, and look at what Putin's goals were after he had been reelected president in 2004 for the second time. He's now elected in 2000, reelected in 2004. To my mind, Mr. Putin had three central goals. First was to reestablish Russia as a great power, to end America's unipolar dominance in the world, and what that translated as was working with any and every anti-American force he could find to weaken American power. Number two, and also very important, to build up the Russian economy on a high-tech basis. So it's not just the seller of oil and natural gas. And it began to push for the sale of sophisticated weapons, of nuclear reactors, and other high-tech equipment. And third, and I think equally important, he was faced from his first presidency with a rebellion in Chechnya, which had become an Islamist rebellion. So he started courting the Muslim world, and especially the Arab world, to get them to cut aid to the Chechen rebels. So these are really the first three goals. Now, let me go first and foremost about goal number one, weakening American power. And by 2005, I think he decided that the U.S. was having increasing problems in the Middle East. It was very vulnerable there, and that was a place where Russia could flex its muscles. And if you look at the actions he took in 2005 and 2006, 2007, they make a very unfortunate pattern of Russian aggressiveness. And let me tick them off one by one. January 2005. Syria is very isolated because of its heavy-handed policy in Lebanon. The Russians agree to waive 90% of the Syrian debt. And by the way, thanks to the rise in oil prices, they're able to show that largesse. And 1 month later, in February, having sold the Syrians some sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, Mr. Hariri, Rafik Hariri, the former Lebanese prime minister, is assassinated. This creates a huge stir in Paris and Washington. Remember, from the American perspective, we're in the middle of pushing democracy in the Middle East, and Hariri was certainly an example of that. And the Syrians seem to have been blamed. And there was an establishment of a UN commission to try to investigate this, and the Russians sabotaged that mission to the greatest degree possible and tried to prevent any sanctions on Syria for its alleged action. Okay, January, February 2005. At the same time, the Russians decide, in the face of increasing evidence of the secret Iranian nuclear facilities that had been discovered in 2002, the Russians are going to sell them the nuclear fuel for the Bushehr reactor anyway, something they had not done in 2003 and 2004. But the key moment, in my view, comes in July of 2005. At that time, an election in Iran brings Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as the new Iranian president. The very first thing he does is break off negotiations with the European Union about stopping Iran's nuclearization and development of nuclear fuel in return for certain economic and strategic benefits to Iran. He contemptuously breaks them off, announced, we're going full out for nuclearization. A couple months later, he says it's time to wipe Israel off the map and denied there ever was a Holocaust. Now, in the face of all this, the Russians go ahead and sell the short-range Tor surface-to-air missile system in November of 2005 to Iran, despite the fact the Iranians have snubbed the UN, snubbed the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, the Russians are also trying very hard to prevent any sanctions at the UN against Iran. Now we're in January of 2006, the next thing that was done. Hamas, as you might remember, wins the elections for the Palestine Legislative Council. Immediately, the quartet, organized by Secretary of State Rice, says there will be no dealings. And the diplomatic quartet, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, United States, United Nations, European Union, and Russia. And all four decide no dealing with Hamas unless it's willing to recognize Israel and renounce violence, because as you know, the Hamas Charter, something we've discussed here in other meetings of the Council, calls for the elimination of Israel. Russia immediately broke with the consensus, invited a Hamas delegation to Moscow, thereby giving it diplomatic legitimacy. Not a very friendly act by Mr. Putin, who said the election of Hamas was a major blow to U.S. policy in the Middle East. I should mention that in return for giving Hamas the legitimacy it desperately needed, Hamas people went ahead and said publicly that Chechnya is an internal matter of Russia and not an Islamic issue. That was the trade-off. But the end result was a break in the quartet's unity on the issue. Well, let's move forward now to July 2006. War between Israel and Hezbollah. What happens? The Russians turn a blind eye when Syria ships very powerful anti-tank weapons to Hezbollah, which it uses quite successfully against the Israelis in the war. The U.S. protests, wants sanctions against Syria. Russia rejects it. And I could go on and on. Now, the interesting name of the game for the Russians begins, though, the end of 2006 and early 2007, as the Russians try to sort of eat their cake and have it too. The Russians, up until this time in the Middle East, have established relations with Hezbollah and Hamas, which are not on their terrorist list, increasingly strong relations with Iran and with Syria. But these are still outcasts in the Middle East. The key players are the Sunni Arabs, talking about Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Egypt. Now, the thing about this is the Russians would like to cultivate them for goal number 2, high-tech economic development for Russia. So Putin, after launching a bitter anti-American tirade at the Munich Security Conference, and it was bitter, if anybody wants to look it up, goes to Saudi Arabia and goes to Jordan, goes to the Gulf, and looking for business for Russian companies. Joint projects in oil, banking, getting the Arabs to invest in the space program of Russia. Now, he doesn't get there free. He has to do something as a gesture for the Sunnis, because the Sunni Arabs, as I think everybody in this room know, are very suspicious of Shiite Iran. So before he goes, he agrees to very limited sanctions against Iran at the Security Council. And when he comes back from the visit, having heard, I'm sure, a lot about Iran during the visit, he agrees to a second set of sanctions. But again, nothing very serious, more or less a sop to the Sunni Arabs. So now, by the time we get to the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Russia at the same time is trying to cultivate in the Middle East rogue organizations and rogue states, Iran, Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and also trying for a second goal of Mr. Putin to cultivate the rich Sunni Arabs as well. And sort of leads us into the impact of all this on the invasion and what exactly happened. Well, the Syrians, in a move which reminded me so much of what Hafiz Assad did, that's the father of the current Syrian leader, Bashar Assad. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, as you might remember, the Syrians were the only Arabs to strongly endorse it. In return, Hafiz Assad's Syria got billions of dollars very cheaply of Russian, then Soviet arms. Well, like father, like son. Bashar Assad was one of the very few international leaders to endorse the invasion of Georgia. And I think he was expecting a similar reward that his father got. And he asked for a series of arms, including the Iskander-E, which is a solid fuel, short range, very powerful missile, ground-to-ground missile that could cover all of Israel. Great destruction. But Lavrov, the foreign minister, said, no, we'll only consider this. They talked some more, and apparently the one agreement to come out of the meeting was the Russians will now have much more use of the Syrian port of Tartus for their fleet, which they're rebuilding in the Mediterranean. The old Soviet fleet disintegrated. Now Moscow, with its increasing funds, thanks to oil, is busily rebuilding its fleet, and it's going to use Tartus as a base with its floating docks. Now, why was Mr. Assad disappointed? In fact, he made a point, if you look at his comments at the time, of trying to inveigle the Russians into two things. The first thing was say, hey, we would be willing to give you a base so you can confront the Americans in the Middle East. Now, his thinking is, if there's a Russian base there and war comes between Israel and Syria, the Israelis are going to be less likely to attack Syria if there are Russian soldiers there. Of course, Assad, when that went over like a lead balloon, Assad denied he ever said it, but he said it. The other thing he wanted to do, he made very strong point of it. He said, look, Israel might have been popular once in Russia, but now look what they've done. They've sold weapons to Georgia. They can't be popular there anymore. Now, of course, the U.S. sold weapons to Georgia. So did France. So did Turkey. But he highlighted the Israeli role. But interesting enough, so far at least, he hasn't gotten the weapons that he's wanted. Why not? And this deals with a very peculiar Russian-Israeli relationship, which you have to almost say is a schizophrenic relationship. On the multilateral level, Russia has been arming Syria, anti-tank weapons, short-range anti-aircraft weapons, as I said, some of which were transferred to Hezbollah, has been arming Iran, enemy of Israel, has given diplomatic legitimacy to Hamas and Hezbollah, also enemies of Israel. So you would say this would really poison the relationship. But on the bilateral Russian-Israeli relationship or side, things are actually rather good. $2.5 billion of trade a year and growing, a lot of it in the high-tech trade, which Putin needs to build up the Russian economy. Russia and Israel are actually cooperating on producing an AWACS aircraft, that is an observation aircraft, where the Russians provide the airframe and the Israelis the avionics. There are major cultural relations back and forth. A cultural center was just set up in Tel Aviv. There are actually party-to-party relations between the Kadima Party, the one currently ruling Israel, and the United Russia Party of Putin. And I could go on and on. So bilateral, good; multilateral, horrible. Why? And as I look at the question, and I think the Israelis are daydreaming if they think the situation's ever going to improve, but my interviews in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, when I asked them about this, they said, look, Russians separate bilateral from multilateral, and anyway, things could get worse. All right, so why are the Russians doing this? Well, first of all, Putin sees the diaspora Russian-speaking community as a major asset for Russia. And the largest diaspora Russian-speaking community outside of the former Soviet Union is in Israel. Number two, as already mentioned, the high-tech trade that they can get with the Israelis. And that's important for them too. Number three, Russia wants to be a great power, therefore it must play a role in the Middle East peace process. Well, you can't play a role in the Middle East peace process unless you talk to the Israelis and have very close diplomatic ties with them. And it's not accidental. We in Russia say, ni sluchayna, that just as Bashar Assad was flying off to Moscow to make his pitch for weapons, advanced weapons from the Russians, President Medvedev was having a talk over the phone with Prime Minister Olmert. So you want to maintain that you're playing the game, and the Russians are hoping either in November or next spring to have an international peace conference in the Middle East in Moscow to further highlight the importance of Russia, and for that, obviously, he needs the Israeli okay. So again, very interesting relationship. And most interesting of all, and it shows you splits within the Russian establishment. While some in the military publicly denounced Israel for selling weapons to Georgia, the Foreign Minister Lavrov praised the Israelis for stopping the sale of weapons before the war started. So it gives you an idea as to this kind of relationship. Let me move on now to two other countries. Let me start with Turkey. The Turks and the Russians have fought 12 wars in the past 300 years. Not a lot of good history between them, and of course, Russia expanded, as you all know, at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. At the end of World War II, Russia demanded bases in the Turkish Straits of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, an action which drove Turkey into the arms of the United States, made it join NATO. Now, Russian or Soviet-Turkish relations began to improve in the early 1980s when a natural gas deal was signed. In the 1990s, there were mixed relations, initially with the Russians backing Azerbaijan and the Turks backing Azerbaijan and the Russians backing Armenia. Russia and Turkey almost came to blows over the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. A few years later, the Russians were accusing the Turks of backing the Chechen rebels. The Turks were accusing the Russians of backing the Kurdish insurrection against Turkey. Things began, by the end of the 1990s, things began to improve. A major natural gas agreement called the Blue Stream Agreement was signed in 1997. And now Turkey is dependent for more than 60% of its natural gas on imports from Russia. Indeed, Russia is Turkey's #1 trade partner, over $25 billion a year. Lots of Russian tourists come to Turkey. Lots of Turkish construction companies work in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So you see, it's a really symbiotic economic relationship. Now, Turkey was on the horns of a dilemma with the invasion of Georgia. Turks had been arming Georgia. There have been increasingly close military ties between Turkey and Georgia, on the one hand. And the invasion brought back unhappy memories of Russian pressure against Turkey as well. But on the other hand, you had these huge trade relations. So how the Turks finessed this was to come up with this Caucasus Peace Initiative, trying to get the Russians and the Georgians and the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians to all come together in this grand organization to work out peace. Now, it's not, quite honestly, a very realistic idea, given the continued tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia and the fact that Georgians and the Russians are still at each other's throats. But for the Turks, caught between the two poles of economic dependence on the one hand and desire to help Georgia and extend its own influence into the Transcaucasus on the other, it's the best the Turks could come up with. The Russians, however, were not entirely happy with the Turkish position, put an embargo on Turkish exports to Russia, which, according to a report I saw last week, may have cost the Turks $1 billion, just to remind the Turks, hey guys, be careful what you do. Now this brings us to the impact of the invasion on Iran. Now on the surface, there's no question that this helped Iran. Number one, the chances, minimal though they were, of any serious economic sanctions against Iran because of its continued opposition to pressure from the International Atomic Energy Agency, chances for sanctions went down the drain. While the Russians pro forma signed a statement the other day, no sanctions. So that's not going to happen. Well, that of course raises the question, if there's no chance for serious sanctions, then maybe the Israelis or possibly even the United States in the latter months of the Bush administration, despite it being bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, might decide, well, if diplomacy can't do it, maybe the only solution to take out the Iranian nuclear establishment is a military one. So on the one hand, Iran benefits. On the other hand, it raises the danger of an outside attack. Number two, however, by granting independence and trying to get world support for independence for Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, it has to get the Iranians worried. The Turks worry about it because of their Kurdish rebellion, which continues. And independence for South Ossetia, independence for Abkhazia can only strengthen the Kurds' desire for independence. Well, there are Kurds in Iran, there are Azeri in Iran, there are Bakhtiari in Iran, there are lots of minority nationalities in Iran as well. And the Iranians can't be overly joyed that the example of independence for small minority nationalities has been supported by the Russians. Hence, Iran very, very cautious in its support of the Russian move into Georgia. Did not recognize the independence of Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia. Only Russia and Nicaragua have done that so far, interestingly enough. All right, now it brings us back, of course, to the final question, and that is Russian-American relations. Are we back in a new Cold War? Well, technically we're not, because the Cold War was defined as an ideological battle between communism and capitalism, which pitted the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies in the Warsaw Pact against the United States and its NATO allies. Obviously, we don't have that today. The old Warsaw Pact is dead, and most of its members are in NATO, as are the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. What we have is a resurgent Russia, which in some ways reminds me of Germany on the eve of World War I, trying to get as far as it can. And the question emerges then, what do you do about it? There are two schools of thought in the United States right now. The penalizers on the one hand, who argue no business as usual, because of the Russians did in Georgia, and those who say, well, wait a minute, we still have common interests with the Russians. Let's not go too far. And let me discuss each of their positions with you very briefly. All right, the penalizers. Don't let the Russians into the WTO. Don't waive Jackson-Vanik. Kick them out of the G8. Abolish the NATO-Russia Council. No more military exercises with Russia. Go further. get the Europeans to lessen their dependence on Russian oil and natural gas, which, by the way, is quite high. No credits to Russia, limit investment. Penalize Russia because it can't be business as usual given what it did in Georgia. The common interesters, if I can use that term. They say, wait a minute, we have common interests with Russia. We got to stop the Iranians and the North Koreans from getting nuclear weapons. We need their help in the fight against terrorism. We need their help to police up loose nukes so they don't get into the wrong hands. And it's in both of our interests to stop the arms race because we can both save money by not building additional nuclear weapons. And I might add to those common interest arguments, we need the Russians to get up to the space station because we're phasing out the shuttle mission unless we want to revive that. And there's going to be a scramble for the Arctic. And it makes a lot more sense to reach agreement with the Russians on the Arctic than have battles over, where is the border as the Arctic ice melts, and we're looking for oil and natural gas there. So, all right, let me look at the arguments of the people saying common interest. They have to be looked at very, very closely. Fighting terrorism. I'm not so sure. With Hamas and Hezbollah, which are on the American and the European terrorist list, they're not on the Russian list. Indeed, as I've argued, they've been embraced by Moscow. So a very limited degree of cooperation in fighting terrorism. Maybe only against the Taliban. The Russians have an interest in preventing a resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan and their ally, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, because they threaten not only revival in Chechnya of the rebellion, which for the time being has been suppressed, but also the soft underbelly of Russia, which is Central Asia. So there is a common interest there. What about help against the North Korean and Iranian nuclear programs? So far, the evidence of Russian help has been absolutely minimal. Certainly in North Korea, where China has borne the load, along with the United States. And in Iran, as I've tried to argue all along, the Russians have agreed to the most minimal sanctions, which aren't serious. And Gazprom, while the United States is trying to sanction Iran economically, Gazprom, the main gas producer in Russia, is out signing one contract after another with the Iranians. So I don't think that's serious. I would raise questions about terrorism. I would raise questions about help with Iran. Now, in the case, there are two other arguments I think that do bear weighing. And I think when we vote later on, another month from now, I want to look at the candidates say about this. Loose nukes remain a problem. And there's some promising initiatives between the United States and Russia, such as creating new atomic reactors whose plutonium cannot be used for weapons. Russia is constructing this giant nuclear waste facility. That's in our interest as well as in the Russian interest. And as I mentioned, the strategic arms, do you need 6,000 nuclear weapons each? Would we just be as safe with 3,000 nuclear weapons each? You have to ask these questions seriously. All right, so summing up, because we wanted to leave time for Q&A, what do we have with Russia in the Middle East and in Russian-American relations? We have an increasingly aggressive Russia, clearly since 2004, 2005, capitalizing on the fact the U.S. has gotten bogged down in Iraq and bogged down in Afghanistan, and now with economic problems, although I should mention the Russians have had to pump in $135 billion in the last couple of weeks to strengthen their banking system, which was a lot weaker, believe it or not, than ours. So we have a newly aggressive Russia, and the challenge is how to deal with it intelligently. Can we deal with it intelligently so the Russians can know that it's not business as usual and you can't invade Georgia, you can't do these things without paying a penalty? Now, can we do that without shooting ourselves in the feet and hurting our own interests? That's the question that I hope will be dealt with in tonight's debate, although I'm somewhat doubtful, between the vice presidential candidates and later on the campaign trail. Well, in any case, I've covered a huge amount of material. I'm sure you have lots of questions, so if Dr. Burd would be kind enough to help me with the Q&A.
Well, we thank you for that huge amount of information, Bob. It's a wonderful picture. Yes, ma'am. Is any aggressive action, like taking out the nuclear sites in Iran, really a plausible policy?
Well, let me try to answer that in two ways. It's a very good question, and it merits a very serious answer. First of all, the Iranians have indeed done things against us. They were responsible for blowing up the Marine barracks in 1983 in Beirut. Hezbollah, which was their tool, did it. The Iranians also have been smuggling weapons into Iraq, which have been used to kill American soldiers. So the Iranians aren't entirely innocent here. There are basically four arguments that have been made against bombing Iran. First off, the Iranian people as a whole don't like the Iranian government. Therefore, you're going to rally them around if you bomb them. Well, the answer to that one is that the supreme religious leader, Khamenei, has personally anointed Ahmadinejad for a second term as president. And under the circumstances, whatever the people of Iran think, it's not going to matter very much. That's number one. Number two is, they're going to they're going to blockade the Straits of Hormuz, through which 16 million barrels of oil flow every day. Well, are they going to be more able to do that when you have nuclear weapons, if they have nuclear weapons, or not? So that's, I don't think, all that serious of a response, quite honestly. All right, number three, and this is much more serious, is that the U.S. has bases which are vulnerable in the region, all over the Middle East. And they could be in line of fire from Iranian missiles if the Iranians choose, assuming my own feeling is the U.S. is not going to attack, but the Israelis probably will. And if the Iranians respond against the Americans, okay, that's a problem. On the other hand, and this is important to note, if you're in a confrontation with the Iranians, do you want to have it when the Iranians have nuclear weapons or when they don't have nuclear weapons? That's the third thing. The fourth thing is perhaps a bit more speculative. I don't know how many of you people had a chance to listen to public radio at 3 o'clock this afternoon, but an ex-CIA guy was talking about Iran and the bomb, et cetera. The question is, when will the Iranians get the bomb? David Kay, who was the inspector and an old friend of mine, by the way, says, 2 to 5 years. The Israelis say 1 year. It's an existential problem for the Israelis. It's not an existential problem for the U.S. Ahmadinejad and Khamenei both call for the destruction of Israel. In the case of Ahmadinejad, there's the hope that the hidden Mahdi will return and a major cataclysmic event will be something which may bring him back. And this is something that really worries the Israelis. So to put it mildly, or as mildly as possible, my own feeling is with Gates as Secretary of Defense, with a Democratic Congress, with the U.S. bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. is probably not going to be involved in any attack. So you don't have to worry about your 5 grandchildren initially. I think the Israelis, who do see an existential threat from Iran, will be involved. They'll be the ones who'll do it.
Did the Russians attack because of ethnic reasons?
Okay. First of all, if you're going back in history, it's a very good question, very serious question. If you go back in history, Stalin was a guy responsible because he stuck different ethnic groups together into one country or one Republic of Georgia. And the first Georgian leader, a guy named Gamsa tried to reintegrate them. But again, I guess it all depends on the facts that you select out. And I select out the facts that in the fighting you mentioned in 1992, the Russians came to the aid of the Abkhazi and the South Ossetians, and the so-called peacekeepers there were in fact Russian soldiers. And what I've argued all along in the buildup and the pressure against Georgia, whether it's a blockade and preventing Georgian wines and mineral water from coming into Russia. That's back in 2006. There was a steady buildup of Russian pressure on Georgia to try to get it to knuckle under. And the Abkhazi, to whom, and the South Ossetians, the Russians were distributing, citizenship papers to them. And then they intervened to help their new citizens. I think this was, as I see the events, it was a sucker punch. Saakashvili was sucked in, and the Russians were looking for the pretext, and they got it. And in terms of the oil pipelines, you're not entirely correct, because Azerbaijan has oil pipelines. Remember, one is Baku to Tbilisi-Ceyhan. One goes there. They stopped filling that one. They sent some more down through Iran because they're worried about the political impact. Kazakhstan was going to build a major refinery in Georgia. They just canceled their plans. So the Russian effort, I would suggest, was maybe a bit more serious than you indicate.
Want to comment on Sevastopol?
Okay, we'll go one, two, three. Yeah.
Yeah, and would you comment upon our putting weapons into Chechnya secretively? And your other question was, why didn't the Russians deal with one of the pipelines?
If they break the pipeline. Okay. To get into the Ukrainian situation, you have to deal with foreign policy and domestic politics, and we have to answer it both ways. First of all, in 1997, a treaty was signed between Russia and Ukraine, giving the Russians the right to use the military base of Sevastopol, which is in the Crimea, for 20 years. Runs out in 2017, which is not all that long from now. And the Ukrainian president, Mr. Yushchenko, is already asking them, let's start negotiating the end of it. But it gets more complicated than that, because Sevastopol is located in the Crimea, which is 58% Russian ethnic. And not accidental, as again we say in Russian, Nislu China, the Ukrainians have been accusing the Russians of passing out more and more Russian citizenship papers to people in Ukraine. Does that sound familiar? So you get a pretext for intervening. Now, there is a fear that the Crimea might go the same way as South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Now, can this be prevented? Now, this is where we got to get into domestic politics in Ukraine. There are three different players here. Viktor Yushchenko is currently the president, doesn't like the Russians at all, wants the Russians out of their base in Sevastopol, and wants to join NATO, okay? His main opponent is the ex-president, Viktor Yanukovych, who had been Putin's man, by the way, and who Putin backed in the 2004 election, which was overturned because it was fraudulent and led to the Orange Revolution and masses of people coming into the streets, which certainly embarrassed Putin no end. He and his party are pro-Russian. The swing person in this is the Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko, who once was allied with Yushchenko and now seems to be allied with Yanukovych, back and forth. And the parliament looks like it's going to go out of business in about 21 days from now. So in order to find out what's going to happen, if there are new elections, as might be sooner rather than later, and if the pro-Russian faction comes in, Tymoshenko and Yanukovych, then there's less likely, I would suggest, for an open clash between Russia and Ukraine. On the other hand, if Yushchenko wins, and Yushchenko wants into NATO, interesting question. Now, to get to your other points, several things. The United States armed the Georgians, by the way, not to invade South Ossetia and Abkhazia primarily, but to protect the pipeline. And a lot of the stores and efforts to protect the pipeline militarily were destroyed by the Russians. I should mention there was a lot of ethnic cleansing of burning down Georgian villages by South Ossetians in the process as well. And it's not accidental that the Russians have not allowed any EU observers into South Ossetia or Abkhazia to see what the treatment of the local Georgians are, most of whom have fled, I should mention. So there you have a problem. Now, there have been several suggestions, because where's the danger? The danger could be to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Could be to Ukraine. Could be, again, to Georgia. So in the case of NATO members, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Georgia and Ukraine are not members, even Gates, the most cautious Secretary of Defense the United States has had for many years, I might add, has suggested joint maneuvers with these countries to sort of raise the threshold of any Russian attack, or maybe even a NATO rapid reaction force to be stationed there, which would also raise the threshold of any attack. In the case of Ukraine and Georgia, the idea is to build them up economically and militarily if necessary. Now, there's one way out of this problem, which should have been taken. I don't know if it's still possible, but I want to go back, if I may, Frank, to a breakfast we had, I guess, was it 12, 13 years ago, with the Estonian ambassador. Do you remember? The three of us had a breakfast together. Dr. Burd was kind enough to invite me to breakfast. At that point, he was talking about Estonia joining NATO. And my feeling at the time was, you know, this unnecessarily aggravates the Russians. It's not necessary. And he was going on to all the reasons why it should. The lost opportunity was way back with the first extension of NATO in 1997, bringing in Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, is to get a serious Russian relationship with NATO. So A, they didn't see it as a threat, and B, a rabble-rouser like Putin couldn't later come up and say it's a threat. Now, that opportunity was lost. My own feeling is that perhaps it might not be too late to resurrect that opportunity, but to do it in the context of the American ABM installations in the Czech Republic and Poland, the missiles, the Czech Republic, the radars. The Russians keep claiming that this is being aimed at them. The U.S. says, no, it's aimed at Iran, which after all is continuing to develop its missiles, could one day be aimed at the United States, and North Korea, which already has an atomic capability. Now, what you want to do here is bring the Russians in to the point where they can be convinced that this ABM system, which, again, I was not in favor of, but it's been established or being established, is not a threat to them. And that's, one could argue, is part of the common interest. But it's a fine line. I mean, the Russians did go into Georgia. There was ethnic cleansing of Georgian villages in Abkhazia and especially in South Ossetia. A lot of equipment protecting the pipeline was destroyed. The Russians have yet to withdraw from Georgia proper. They've beefed up their forces. They've doubled their forces in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. You know, so it can't be business as usual, but I come back to the point that I mentioned. You know, how do you penalize them without shooting yourself in the foot? And that's really the challenge we face.
The question is if indeed the United States can justify local wishes in Kosovo, why can't local wishes govern the borders of Russia as well?
Well, then the question, of course, is why the Chinese are so unhappy. Because the people in Xinjiang would like to separate themselves from China. So what do you do there? The Kurds would love to separate themselves from Turkey and from Syria and from Iran and from Iraq as well, and establish an independent Kurdish state. And I could go on and on and on. So the question, your question is a critical one. Where does sovereignty end and where does national self-determination start? Do you do this case by case? The Africans, remember, had this problem because it cut the borders of the colonialists that drew right across the tribes. And the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, early on decided these are crazy borders, they cut across tribes, but once we start meddling with the borders, chaos will take place. And for better or for worse, most in the international community tend to argue that that principle has to stay. In the case of Kosovo, I will draw you back, or the case of the Bosnian Muslims, you remember the breakup of Yugoslavia. You know, when there was ethnic cleansing bordering on genocide going on, there was a feeling that intervention had to happen and these people had to have a certain degree of independence. Hopefully, people hope piously, the Kosovars and the Serbs could work together. Obviously, after 10 years, they couldn't. But I think the irony of all this is, if genocide or perceived genocide or ethnic cleansing takes place, that strengthens the case of those who want independence for that particular ethnic group. As of now, in Xinjiang, it's not ethnic cleansing, but it's movement of Chinese into Xinjiang. Now, you're not cleansing the ethnics there, you're just maybe robbing them of their culture. Same thing going on with Tibet, for that matter. So I guess that's really the topic of another lecture. Somebody from the UN, I think.
Can you imagine a cluster of nations banded together in harmony to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by threatening the existence of anyone who goes ahead and uses them?
An interesting proposition. Right now, I think the international effort is to prevent others from getting the bombs. I mean, what we have now are the 5 original nuclear powers: France, the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, China, okay, plus India, Pakistan, and everybody believes Israel. Okay, so that's 8. Now, well, North Korea is almost there, maybe not 100%. Now, the danger, one of the dangers of Iran getting the bomb, by the way, is it's fascinating for those of us who study the Middle East. That's why I love the Middle East. It's so fascinating. When Israel had the bomb, and everybody thought they've had it since 1960, there was no pressure on the Arab states to go nuclear. Now that Iran is getting the bomb, there's a major effort across the Arab world to go nuclear. And if Iran does get the bomb, then the Saudis, Jordanians, Egyptians will be coming right along to get one to match it. And then we're going to have a real proliferation problem. So whether the idea is to try to nip it in the bud and try to convince these people, hey, don't do it, or we'll protect you, or use your rather strong suggestion about destroying anybody who uses the bomb. The problem is proving that the bomb was sent by country A into country B. If it's a suitcase bomb or one of those, there's denial. We never did it. I mean, look, Pakistan sent all sorts of these nuclear secrets to Iran. Pakistan has denial. So that's why at least some in the international community feel it's best to try to nip it at the bud now, and that bud happens to be Iran.
Well, this was certainly hugely informative. Very seldom does one say something is informative and mean it as a huge compliment, but we do indeed. It's been a wonderful evening, Bob.
Thank you very much.